Hello, friends. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Here, I share a brand new story every day. If you enjoy my videos, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's dive into today's story. This incident happened just this morning, June 9th, 2024, around 6 a.m. I'm not saying it's definitely paranormal, but something was seriously off. My dad and I had taken a weekend trip to Lake Arrowhead, California for a family gathering. We were given an Airbnb that was originally booked by my cousin, but he opted to stay elsewhere and offered it to us. My aunt had stayed at this same Airbnb a while back, but on the opposite side, as it's a ranch-style duplex. When we arrived late Friday evening, everything seemed perfectly normal. The house had a comfortable, open floor plan. The moment you enter, you step right into the living room, with the kitchen just ahead. On the right side of the living room, a short hallway leads to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The rooms are on opposite sides of the hall, with one on the right and the other on the left, right next to the bathroom. Here's where it gets crucial. The bedroom on the left has an odd door that connects directly to the bathroom. My room was at the back of the house, tucked away near the door leading to the backyard. From my window, I could see the patio and a small hot tub, though we never got around to using them. My dad initially chose the front bedroom, but after seeing the bed, he decided he'd rather sleep on the long couch in the living room. Saturday went smoothly, and the family event was great. Afterward, my dad and I grabbed dinner at a local spot and returned to the Airbnb sometime after 10 p.m. He mentioned that one of my uncles and his daughter were stopping by, but I was exhausted and knocked out the moment my head hit the pillow. I didn't even hear them come in. I woke up around 4 a.m. and laid in bed scrolling on my phone for an hour. Eventually, I had to use the bathroom, so I got up, groggily shuffled through the kitchen, and saw my dad passed out on the couch, snoring loudly. I did my business and went back to bed, still hearing nothing out of the ordinary. An hour later, nature called again. This time, as I walked into the kitchen, I noticed something weird. A light was on in the front bedroom, the one my dad had passed on earlier. Weird, I thought. My dad was still on the couch, snoring away like a freight train. I figured maybe my uncle and his daughter had stayed the night. But when I checked both bedrooms, they were empty. Now I was seriously confused. I pulled out my phone and started recording a video, more out of instinct than anything. The whole situation felt off. I reluctantly tried waking my dad, lightly tapping his hand, but he was dead asleep. Just then, I thought I heard a faint humming sound, a female voice coming from the lit-up bedroom. I froze. My skin prickled as I felt an intense coldness in the air, the kind that sends a shiver straight to your bones. The AC was running, but this chill felt unnatural. I brushed it off as paranoia, but the light being on in that empty room was hard to ignore. When my dad finally woke up, he groggily muttered something about maybe leaving the light on by accident before passing out again. But I knew he hadn't been up at all. I would have heard it in the dead silence of the house. Determined to figure it out, I went to the room and tried the light switches. None of them worked. It wasn't until I found a remote on the nightstand that I could finally turn off the light. Creepy, right? I headed back to my room, trying to shake off the eerie vibes. By now, the sun was starting to rise, but I was wide awake, completely on edge. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that I was just tired. But when I walked past the kitchen again, the coldness hit me even harder. It was like the temperature dropped by 10 degrees the moment I stepped near that hallway. I eventually dozed off, but woke up a couple of hours later, still rattled. I checked the rooms again, but everything seemed normal, except the coldness was still there. My dad woke up, took a shower, and we chatted about what happened. He insisted he must have left the light on, but I could tell even he was unsettled. As we packed up to leave, the cold sensation finally lifted and the house felt normal again. We checked out without further incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been watching us. I don't know what was going on in that Airbnb, but it was easily one of the strangest experiences I've had. What do you think happened? Let me know in the comments. In June 2021, when travel restrictions began easing, my girlfriend Maya and I decided to take a road trip to the scenic mountains of Himachal Pradesh, India. We had mapped out a route from Chandigarh to Dharamshala, then Palampur, and finally Bir Billing. We had always been drawn to quaint historic stays, and after reading reviews, we decided to book an Airbnb, a beautiful old mansion nestled amidst the Palampur tea gardens. The place was advertised as a heritage property that dated back to the British era, offering an authentic experience. The listing had pictures of a serene garden, vintage furniture, and scenic views. It seemed perfect for a romantic getaway. However, little did we know that this picturesque house held secrets that would haunt us for years to come. We arrived at the mansion around 2 p.m., greeted by the friendly yet oddly reserved host, Mr. Sharma. The mansion was as grand as the photos promised, with large wooden doors, creaking floorboards, and antique decor that transported us to another time. We were given the top floor corner room, room 301, which the host described as offering the most privacy and the best views of the surrounding gardens. The day passed uneventfully as we explored the local attractions, including an ancient church and the sprawling tea gardens. By the time we returned to the Airbnb, night had already descended, wrapping the mansion in a thick blanket of darkness. That's when the atmosphere began to shift. While relaxing in our room, we suddenly heard loud noises from the adjacent room, as if furniture was being dragged across the floor and people were bustling about. It sounded like an entire crew was busy rearranging the room next door. Curious, I decided to step out and ask them to keep it down. But when I opened the door to the dimly lit corridor, there was no one there. The noises ceased abruptly, leaving nothing but an eerie silence. I shrugged it off, assuming it was the creaky old building playing tricks on us. Later, Maya and I went down to the garden for a late-night stroll. The garden had long rows of metal chairs and tables set up, perfect for outdoor gatherings. As we walked, we distinctly heard muffled conversations, like the chatter of a dinner party. But every time we turned to look, the chairs were empty. We dismissed it as our imagination until a staff member approached us, warning us not to wander too far into the garden for our safety. The cryptic warning left us both feeling uneasy, but we decided to return to our room and call it a night. Back in the room, the disturbances escalated. The noises from the next room returned, now louder and more aggressive, furniture being slammed, heavy footsteps, and what sounded like people shouting orders to each other. Our walls vibrated, causing the chandelier in our room to sway. At one point, there were several loud knocks on our door. When I opened it, there was nothing but darkness stretching down both ends of the corridor. The knocking continued several times, and each time I found no one there. We called the reception and asked for water. When the attendant finally arrived, he seemed nervous and in a hurry to leave. Before he could dart away, I asked him about the incessant noise and if other guests were partying next door. He gave us a strained smile and said he'd check, but he didn't return. The night was long and filled with unexplainable events. The knocking grew more intense, accompanied by faint whispers, and at one point we heard what sounded like footsteps right inside our room, though we saw no one. Maya was terrified, clinging to me as we huddled on the bed, trying to rationalize what was happening. I tried to remain calm for her sake, but I was just as unnerved. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As daylight filtered through the curtains, the noises vanished and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. During checkout, Maya insisted I ask the manager about the disturbances. When I hesitantly brought it up, his expression changed instantly. He looked uncomfortable, glancing at the other staff members before replying, "We put you in room 301 because it's the most private and no other guests were staying on your floor." The words sent a chill down our spines. The staff exchanged uneasy looks, and that's when the manager confessed, "The room next to yours hasn't been occupied in months. It's been kept closed due to some incidents." Shocked, we pressed for more details, but the staff clammed up. They quickly processed our payment and avoided answering any more questions. We left the mansion in a daze, replaying everything that happened. It felt surreal, like a waking nightmare. We drove straight to Burr Billing, where we crashed at our next hotel and slept for hours, exhausted from the previous night's ordeal. Despite trying to move past it, that haunted Airbnb in Palampur still lingers in our memories. We later learned from locals that the mansion had a history of paranormal activity. It was rumored that decades ago, a tragic fire took the lives of a British family who lived there, and ever since, guests have reported strange phenomena. especially in room 301. To this day, I can't fully explain what we experienced, but one thing is clear, we will never be returning to that Airbnb. Though I haven't personally encountered anything supernatural, I've always believed in spirits, the afterlife, and things that dwell beyond the veil. This eerie event, however, happened to my husband, let's call him Ben, and his two friends during a weekend getaway they'll never forget. They had planned a quick, fun trip to a remote town deep in the heart of Pennsylvania, but what they experienced during their stay at a questionable Airbnb turned their holiday into a nightmare. It was the summer of 2010, and Ben, along with his buddies Mark, and Kyle, decided to book a rustic, off-the-grid cabin listed on Airbnb. The pictures online portrayed the place as a cozy retreat surrounded by towering trees, a babbling brook nearby, and all the charm of rural living. They had plans to explore local hiking trails and enjoy some nature away from the city. Little did they know they'd be spending most of their time trying to escape whatever lurked in that old house. The trio arrived at the Airbnb in the early afternoon. The cabin was nestled in a remote area, surrounded by thick woods, and the nearest town was miles away. From the outside, the cabin looked ancient, with peeling paint, creaky wooden steps, and an overgrown yard that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The eerie silence of the surroundings, coupled with the sight of the decrepit cabin, made Ben uneasy right from the start. But they shrugged it off as part of the rustic charm and settled in. After unpacking, the group ventured into town for some sightseeing and grabbed supplies for dinner. They planned to return to the cabin later that night for a laid-back evening with food, drinks, and some laughs. Mark and Kyle ordered takeout from a small local diner, a couple of burgers, fries, and sodas before they all headed back. Upon arriving, they noticed the air felt colder, heavier somehow. But it was nighttime, and they figured it was just the weather. The cabin's interior was even creepier at night. The lights flickered slightly, as if the old wiring could barely handle the load. Shadows danced on the walls, creating shapes that seemed to stretch and move with a life of their own. They ate dinner in a tense silence, trying to ignore the unsettling atmosphere that had taken hold. After a while, they laughed off their nerves, turned on some music, and soon drifted off to sleep. Ben, being a light sleeper, was the first to notice something was off. He woke up in the middle of the night with an icy cold sensation pressing against his stomach. It felt like a hand, an unnaturally cold hand, wrapped tightly around him. His eyes snapped open, but both Mark and Kyle were fast asleep beside him, huddled on the other side of the bed. The hand lingered for a moment longer before the cold sensation faded away. Shaking it off as a weird dream, Ben closed his eyes, trying to fall back asleep. Suddenly, a faint noise echoed through the room. A low creak, like someone or something moving slowly across the floor. Ben opened his eyes again, this time feeling fully alert. As he scanned the room, his heart dropped. Standing near the foot of the bed, just barely visible in the dim light, was a figure, a woman in a flowing white gown, her hair hanging in thick, tangled strands that concealed her face. But what sent a jolt of terror through him was that she wasn't standing on the ground. She was levitating a few feet above it, floating eerily still as if waiting for them to notice her. Ben tried to wake his friends, whispering in a panicked voice, but it was as if the air had grown thick and oppressive, stifling any sound. Mark and Kyle groggily opened their eyes, and when they saw the floating figure, they froze in horror. The woman's head tilted slightly, acknowledging their collective terror as if she was savoring the moment. Her presence filled the room with a suffocating dread, and the temperature seemed to plummet further. With a surge of adrenaline, they bolted from the bed. Mark and Kyle darted toward the right side stairs while Ben instinctively took the left. But no matter which direction they ran, the figure seemed to be everywhere at once. When Mark and Kyle reached the landing, they found the staircase gate inexplicably locked, something they hadn't noticed before. As they fumbled with it, the ghostly woman materialized directly in front of them, blocking their path with that same eerie silence. In a blind panic, they backtracked and met up with Ben, who had already found the front door. They didn't care about their belongings or anything else. They just needed to get out of there. They sprinted out of the cabin and ran until they reached the safety of the town. The local bus station was the only place with lights still on that late, so they spent the rest of the night there, too scared to return. The next morning, they reluctantly went back to retrieve their things. Still shaken, but determined to get out of there as quickly as possible. The cabin was as still and empty as it had been when they first arrived, yet they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows. As they packed up in record time, Ben noticed something on the bed. It was a small pink hair clip. A child's clip. A child's clip that you might find in a little girl's hair, lying there like a forgotten keepsake. None of them could explain how it got there, but it was enough to send them rushing out the door. They left a scathing review on Airbnb, warning future visitors about the bizarre and terrifying experience. Later, when they mentioned the incident to the locals, they were told the cabin had a dark history. Rumors about a tragic fire that claimed the lives of a mother and her young daughter years ago. It was said that the mother's spirit still roamed the property, eternally searching for her lost child. Whatever the truth was, Ben and his friends knew one thing for sure. They were never setting foot in that Airbnb again. Even now, years later, whenever Ben tells the story, he can still feel the cold grip of that hand around his stomach and see the image of that floating woman burned into his memory. In the late summer of 2019, my brother Jake and I decided to rent an Airbnb for a weekend getaway in Austin, Texas. We found this quirky mid-century house that had a lot of vintage charm, according to the listing. It was located in a quiet, slightly run-down neighborhood with overgrown yards and old houses. The place had a certain nostalgic vibe, which we thought would be fun and relaxing. But from the moment we arrived, the house felt anything but cozy. The house was one of those classic old-style bungalows with creaky wooden floors, dim lighting, and rooms filled with outdated furniture. But the strangest thing was how suffocating the air inside felt. It was as if something unseen was pressing down on us from all sides. We shrugged it off, thinking it was just our imagination or nerves from being in an unfamiliar place. On our first night, I was lounging on the couch in the living room, scrolling through my phone, while Jake was in his bedroom taking a nap. As I settled in, I kept hearing faint creaks and groans from the walls, which I assumed were just normal house sounds. But every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch fleeting shadows darting across the hallway. I brushed it off, figuring it was just the old house playing tricks on me. A while later, Jake stumbled out of his bedroom looking dazed and unnerved. His face was pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes. "Why did you let that weird guy into my room?" he demanded. I was confused. "What are you talking about? It's just you and me here." Jake shook his head, insisting that a teenage boy with long, scraggly blonde hair, wearing a tie-dye shirt, had been standing in his bedroom doorway when he woke up. According to Jake, the guy had just stared at him with a cold, vacant expression and then slowly nodded his head like he was acknowledging Jake's presence. After that, he simply vanished into thin air. I immediately felt a chill crawl down my spine. There was no one else in the house, and Jake had been dead asleep minutes before. We searched every room, double-checked the locks, and even peered out the windows, but we were alone. The whole situation was bizarre and unsettling. The next day, I decided to ask the neighbor next door about the house. She was an older woman who had lived in the area for decades. After exchanging pleasantries, I casually mentioned the odd things happening inside our Airbnb, especially Jake's eerie encounter. As I described the mysterious hippie Jake had seen, her face turned ashen. With a trembling voice, she told me that in the late 1960s, a boy who matched that exact description had died in a fire in the house that once stood next to ours. The charred ruins had been abandoned and overtaken by weeds for years, making it a creepy backdrop to our rental. The boy had been somewhat of a local legend, said to have haunted the area since the fire. My skin crawled as I realized Jake had described the ghost of a kid who had died more than 50 years earlier. The longer we stayed in the house, the worse things got. Strange noises, like distant whispers and footsteps, echoed down the hallway late at night. The lights would flicker on and off on their own, and the doors would randomly slam shut with a force that shook the walls. Even our phones and the TV started malfunctioning, glitching out for no apparent reason. The once cozy living room took on a menacing atmosphere as the shadows seemed to stretch and twist into grotesque shapes. On our last night, things reached a terrifying climax. Around 2 a.m., Jake and I were jolted awake by loud banging noises coming from the walls and ceiling. It sounded like someone, or something, was pounding on the walls, moving from one end of the house to the other. We were paralyzed with fear, too terrified to even get out of bed. Then, from the hallway, we heard a soft, raspy whisper, a single word that neither of us could quite make out. But whatever it was, it filled the room with an icy chill. That was it. We couldn't take it anymore. We packed our bags in the dead of night and left without looking back. The next morning, we canceled the rest of our stay, deciding it wasn't worth the vintage experience anymore. Even after returning home, we couldn't shake the uneasy feeling, like something from that house had latched onto us. Months later, I found myself still obsessing over what had happened in that Airbnb. I did some digging online and found out that several other guests had left similar reviews describing shadowy figures, strange noises, and a lingering presence that made the house feel alive in the worst way possible. Sometimes an Airbnb listing promises you a unique experience, and it delivers in ways you never want to revisit. Looking back, I wish we had trusted our instincts and never set foot in that house. But curiosity often leads us into places we should leave untouched, where the past refuses to stay buried and spirits linger, waiting for someone to acknowledge their presence once more. In 2018, during a much-needed break from work, I booked an Airbnb in a remote part of Pennsylvania. My fiancé, David, had rented an old farmhouse near the mountains for a brief getaway. It wasn't a well-kept, charming country home. Instead, it looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Peeling paint, overgrown weeds, twisted, gnarled trees that loomed over the property like sentinels. Despite the immediate sense of dread that hit me as we pulled into the driveway, I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my nerves acting up from the unfamiliar setting. The inside of the house was worse. It felt suffocating, like the very walls were pressing in on me. The air was thick with negative energy, as if layers of misery and malevolence were built up over decades. I felt like multiple eyes were watching me from unseen corners. The darkness in the house was oppressive, as if the few dim lamps struggled against an overwhelming shadow that consumed the rooms. David wasn't due to arrive for another hour, leaving me alone in this unsettling space. I tried to distract myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being in immediate danger. By the time David got home, my nerves were frayed. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I put on a brave face, but every creak of the old house sent a shiver down my spine. That first night was restless. I barely slept, feeling like something was hovering over me, watching with an intensity that was almost tangible. When I did finally drift off, it was out of sheer exhaustion, not peace of mind. The second night was when things took a more sinister turn. Again, sleep eluded me as I sensed something was wrong. The sensation of being watched grew stronger. It felt like a presence loomed just inches above my face. I could practically feel its breath. When I finally forced myself to close my eyes and ignore it, I somehow managed to sleep, but the terror lingered even in my dreams. The real shock came the next morning. As I stretched awake, I noticed my hair felt odd, heavier than usual. When I reached up, I discovered that a section of my hair had been pulled back and clipped with a small, glittery hair clip, one of those that little girls typically wear. It was pink and clear with sparkles inside, something I had never seen before and certainly didn't own. There were no children in the house, and the clip was foreign to both me and David. The idea that someone, or something, had been close enough to touch me while I was asleep sent a wave of terror through me. How could I have slept through that? The visit continued to spiral into a nightmare. The oppressive atmosphere, the constant unease, and the inexplicable happenings grew worse each day. The lamps would flicker randomly, and cold drafts of air would sweep through rooms where no windows were open. The nights became unbearable as the sense of an unseen force drawing closer grew stronger. Even David, who wasn't usually superstitious, admitted that the house felt off. It felt like the walls were closing in, and whatever entity was in the house was feeding off our fear. We decided to cut the trip short. I changed my flight and left days earlier than planned. The entire experience left me shaken, as if a dark cloud followed us throughout our stay. Even after leaving, I couldn't shake the memory of that sinister place. My father, who had dropped me off at the beginning of the trip, later confessed that he had felt the same sense of dread when he saw the house. He almost turned back to pick me up, but he didn't want to intrude on my plans. I wish he had followed his instinct. To this day, I've had other strange experiences, but nothing compares to the chilling dread of that Airbnb in Pennsylvania. The relationship with David didn't survive much longer after that. But what haunts me most is that I never found out what happened in that house or why it radiated such dark energy. I often think about researching its history, what tragedies or secrets might be buried within those walls. Sometimes it's best to trust your gut and leave certain places undisturbed. Not every old farmhouse is quaint or charming. Some are better left to whatever lingers in the shadows. When my family and I had to move unexpectedly, we quickly found a short-term rental through Airbnb. The house was perfect on paper. A large backyard for the dogs, plenty of space, and located near my son's new school. However, from the moment we moved in, strange things started happening that we couldn't explain. The first thing we noticed was the unnerving feeling that something was watching us. It was subtle at first, just a shadow out of the corner of my eye or a fleeting chill down my spine, but it escalated quickly. My partner works on a 2-week on, 1-week off schedule and was out of town, leaving me alone with the kids and our 2 dogs. I've always been pretty level-headed, but the uneasy atmosphere in this house was getting to me. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I went outside to put the garbage out. I noticed something crouched near the skip bin we'd rented to clear out some of our things. It was dark and shadowy, almost like a person. But when I looked again, it vanished, completely gone in the blink of an eye. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to carry on as if nothing was wrong. I finished putting the bins out and hurried back inside. That night, the dogs, who are usually calm, became restless. They barked at nothing, growled at corners, and wouldn't leave the front windows alone, staring out as if something or someone was standing just out of sight. I didn't sleep much that night, and the dogs' unease only heightened mine. I was hoping it was just a weird one-off night, but things were about to get much worse. A couple of days later, I was getting ready to take a load of stuff to the new house. I backed the trailer into the driveway, which I managed to do on the first try and was quite proud of. Just as I was ready to leave, I jumped into the SUV and nothing. The battery was dead. This made no sense. It was a brand new battery, less than 6 months old. I had to charge it for half an hour before I could get going. I thought it was just a fluke, but that was only the beginning. The next day, my mom and sister came over to help with packing. We worked all day, and when it was time for them to leave, my mom's car wouldn't start. Dead battery. We were confused, but figured it was just a coincidence. I jump-started her car, and then my sister tried to leave. Same thing. Dead battery. I walked over to check the SUV, and guess what? The battery was dead again, even though it had been fine that morning. We had 3 cars with dead batteries in one day. None of it made any sense, and everyone was starting to get freaked out. We managed to jumpstart all the cars and get them going again, but the unease was growing. As we stood in the driveway talking about how strange it was, my sister backed her car into the lamppost, something she clearly should have seen. The post didn't have a scratch, and neither did her car, despite the loud sound of shattering glass we both heard. Yet there was no glass, no damage, nothing. By this point, we were all spooked. Over the next few days, weird things continued to happen. Light bulbs kept flickering and blowing out. The dogs were constantly on edge, barking and growling at empty corners in the house. One night, they both lost it, growling and baring their teeth at the same spot in the room. Something I've never seen them do. It was as if they were seeing something that I couldn't. I tried cleansing the house with white sage, thinking maybe that would help, but the activity didn't stop. I even bought essential oils and made a spray to use around the house, but nothing seemed to make a difference. The atmosphere was heavy and tense, and even though the skip bin was picked up later that week, the eerie feeling remained. The worst part was that feeling of being watched. I woke up several times in the middle of the night, convinced that someone or something was standing in the room with me. The sense of dread was almost suffocating, like a dark cloud hanging over the house. Finally, my partner came back home, and we moved out as quickly as we could. Whatever was haunting that place, it didn't seem to follow us, thank God. But I'll never forget the strange sequence of events that happened at that Airbnb, and I still wonder if it was tied to something left behind by the previous tenants, or something much older and darker, connected to the land itself. If you ever find yourself at an Airbnb where the batteries suddenly die for no reason, take it as a warning. Some energies aren't meant to be disturbed, and some places are better left. I recently stayed at an Airbnb in a remote village in northern Maine, and what I experienced there left me questioning reality. The house sat on a stretch of land rumored to have a dark history. I didn't think much of it when I booked, but after spending a few nights there, I'm convinced something ancient and deeply unsettling still lingers. Let me start by saying that the house itself is charming, a quaint, rustic cabin surrounded by dense woods, but it didn't take long for things to get weird. The land the house is built on is said to have been significant to a forgotten indigenous tribe, a place where ceremonies and rituals were once performed. The locals avoid talking about it, but the few who do mention it say that the area has always felt different. I shrugged it off as small-town superstition. The first few nights were mostly uneventful, except for a few creaks and the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees. Then, on the third night, everything changed. It was around 3 a.m. when I was jolted awake by my cat, Luna. She had accompanied me on this trip and was normally a pretty relaxed cat, but that night she was pacing restlessly, her fur bristling. Luna jumped onto the bed and tapped my face with her icy cold paw, waking me up from a dream I couldn't quite remember. I initially brushed it off, assuming she just wanted attention or a late-night snack, but her behavior was unusual. She kept nudging me toward the kitchen, which wasn't like her at all. Thinking maybe she heard something outside, I grabbed a flashlight and slipped into my boots before following her to the back door. Luna leaped onto the windowsill, staring out into the dark backyard. I followed her gaze, but everything seemed normal, just an overgrown garden and 2 old maple trees swaying in the wind. But then, as I stood there trying to figure out what was bothering her, I felt it. A sudden shift in the air. It was as if the temperature dropped instantly, and a cold, eerie breeze swept through the yard. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of chanting, low and rhythmic, echoing from somewhere in the woods. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the melodic tones of a Shinto or Buddhist prayer. No, this was ancient, guttural, and almost tribal, like a forgotten ceremony from a culture long erased from history. It sent a shiver down my spine. I scanned the trees with my flashlight, half expecting to see someone out there, but there was nothing. No movement, no figures, just the relentless chanting. I tried to convince myself it was just some strange acoustic effect, maybe wind passing through the trees in a way that made it sound like chanting. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The rhythm, the cadence, it was too deliberate, too human. I decided to investigate, stepping out into the yard with Luna trailing cautiously behind me. I checked the chicken coop first. All the chickens were fine, clucking softly in their sleep. I looked up at the treetops, the 2 ancient maples looming ominously, but saw nothing unusual. Just as I was about to turn back, the chanting grew louder. It felt like it was closing in, wrapping around me from all directions. I swung the flashlight wildly, trying to find the source, but there was nothing there. No neighbors, no animals, just that relentless chanting, droning on and on. It was maddening. My breath clouded in the cold air as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The sound felt like it was seeping into my mind, pulling me into something I couldn't understand. At this point, I was spooked enough to head back inside. Luna stayed by the window, staring out into the darkness as if keeping watch. I lit some white sage and walked around the cabin, hoping to cleanse whatever was out there, but the chanting didn't stop. Even after I closed the windows and retreated to my bedroom, I could still hear it faintly, a haunting rhythm that followed me into sleep. That night, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures performing rituals under the old maple trees, their faces hidden behind animal masks. The chanting in the dream matched exactly what I heard outside, as if the two worlds were merging. The next morning, I reached out to the Airbnb host, who was surprisingly candid about the area's history. They admitted that past guests had mentioned hearing the same chanting, and some even left in the middle of the night, refusing to stay another minute. The host suggested I keep burning sage and recommended placing protective crystals around the property, but even they didn't seem entirely convinced that it would help. As the days went on, the chanting continued. It became a nightly occurrence, always starting around 2 or 3 a.m. and lasting for about an hour. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Luna grew more and more agitated, her eyes constantly darting toward the windows as if she could see something lurking just beyond the glass. On the fifth and final night, I decided to stay awake and record the sounds on my phone. I sat in the living room, waiting in the dark. Sure enough, the chanting began right on schedule. I hit record, but the moment I did, the sound stopped. Complete silence. I felt a deep, bone-chilling cold settle into the room, and for the first time I sensed that whatever was out there was aware of me, watching me. I bolted out of the cabin the next morning, cutting my stay short and leaving a hurried message for the host. They tried to assure me that it was just local folklore and that the chanting was probably nothing more than old spirits passing through. But I knew better. There was something dark and ancient tied to that land, something that refused to be forgotten. I've since seen other reviews mentioning the same experiences, guests who heard strange chanting in the night who felt watched by unseen eyes. The Airbnb has since been taken down, with the host claiming it's under renovation, but I doubt that's the real reason. To this day, I still hear faint echoes of that chanting in my nightmares, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there might have followed me home. Should I have done more to protect myself, or was leaving the only choice? Either way, I won't be returning to that cursed cabin ever again. All right, hear me out. This is going to sound like pure fiction, but I swear it's real. I wanted to share this with all of you who enjoy a good ghost story because what I experienced over a span of 5 days was something I can't fully explain. November 22nd, 2023. It started when my mom and younger sister, Sophie, left the house around noon to pick up groceries for Thanksgiving. We were hosting our family as usual, so there was a lot to prepare. When they returned about an hour and a half later, they unloaded dozens of grocery bags onto the kitchen table. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, at least not at first. But what happened while they were gone shook me to the core. Sophie is 14, almost 15, but she looks and acts a lot younger. If you spent a day with her, you'd probably think she was still in elementary school. That detail becomes important later. I was chilling in the living room, which connects directly to the kitchen. You can see the entire space from where I was sitting, with the stairs to the second floor, right by the front door. The layout is pretty typical. Living room to the right, stairs ahead, and another living room to the left. I was minding my own business when I noticed something strange. A red crayon rolling slowly across the floor, coming to a stop at my foot. I just stared at it for a moment, confused. Then I heard a faint voice calling from upstairs. A girl's voice, maybe 10 years old. My first thought was that it had to be Sophie, even though she had told me she was outside. I figured she must have sneaked back in without me noticing. After all, she's the only other girl in the house, so who else could it be? I got up and headed toward the stairs, but when I reached the first step, I froze. The same red crayon was now lying on the stair as if it had been waiting for me. My stomach dropped. I spun around, rushing back to the living room where I'd first seen it, but the crayon was gone. When I turned back to the stairs, it had somehow moved up to the second step. And then I heard the same voice call out again, clear as day. Come upstairs. Right at that moment, the back door creaked open and Sophie walked in, looking at me like I was crazy. What's wrong? She asked, clearly clueless. Are you messing with me? What's with the red crayon? I demanded. Sophie's brow furrowed. I wasn't even in the house. I've been outside this whole time. A chill ran down my spine. Something was definitely playing a trick on me. But it wasn't Sophie. That night, I had the first of what would become a series of disturbing dreams. In the dream, I stood at the bottom of the stairs staring at the crayon as it slowly rolled up each step. This repeated every night, with the crayon advancing higher and higher until, on the third night, it reached the top step. Suddenly the dream shifted to darkness, and that same eerie voice whispered, "I'm coming for you. You better watch out." I could barely make out the faint outline of a little girl sitting at the top of the stairs, just watching me. It was terrifying, but what was even worse was that I started hearing the same voice in real life, always coming from upstairs. I didn't know what to do, but I was determined to figure out what was going on. I did some digging, hoping to find some history on our house or maybe an urban legend that matched my experience. I came across creepy pastas and local ghost stories, but none of them mentioned a girl with a red crayon. The lack of answers just made the situation feel more sinister. As if things weren't bad enough, our home was listed on Airbnb for holiday guests. A couple booked the place for a weekend stay while we were away visiting family. When we returned, they left a frantic review describing unexplained events. They heard footsteps in the night and found a red crayon lying in different places around the house, no matter how many times they put it away. They even claimed they heard a child's voice giggling upstairs and felt a cold presence lingering in the hallway. I reached out to them, asking for more details, and their story mirrored mine almost exactly. They described a shadowy figure at the top of the stairs and lights flickering randomly at night. They left early, convinced the house was haunted. The review got the attention of paranormal enthusiasts, and before I knew it, people started showing up at our door, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghost. The following week, I decided to try a little experiment. I left the red crayon on the bottom stair before going to bed. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of it scratching against the wood, moving step by step. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and by morning, the crayon was at the top of the stairs, right where the shadowy figure in my dream had been. Things reached a breaking point when Sophie came to me in tears, saying she saw the girl too. She described her as pale, with messy hair and dark, hollow eyes. The girl had been holding the crayon, scribbling on the walls before disappearing into thin air. We knew we had to get out. We listed the house for sale, and since then we've refused to go back. The Airbnb listing has since been taken down, but I occasionally check forums where people discuss haunted houses. Every now and then, someone mentions a little girl with a red crayon, and it sends chills down my spine. I don't know what's haunting that house or why it fixated on us, but one thing's for sure, I'll never forget the red crayon that followed me. It was a balmy summer evening in the remote town of Coldwater Creek, a forgotten spot in the Appalachian Mountains. The town's winding roads are rarely traveled, but one particular stretch, known locally as Hollow Road, holds a chilling secret. The events that took place there have become the stuff of local legend. However, it wasn't until an Airbnb rental in the area that the mystery truly resurfaced. The story begins when my grandmother, Margaret, was in her youth back in the late 1930s. Hollow Road was nothing more than a dirt path cutting through dense woods, flanked by towering pines and twisted oaks. The road was rarely traveled after dusk, but Margaret had to make the walk home alone one moonless night after visiting a friend in Coldwater Creek. Even back then, rumors of strange happenings along the road were whispered, but no one really believed them. Until now. As Margaret walked along the pitch-black road, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She glanced back and caught sight of a faint light bobbing in the distance. At first, she dismissed it as a lantern, perhaps carried by a traveler. But the light drew closer, unnaturally floating above the ground with no visible source. It trailed behind her at a steady pace, never wavering, always maintaining the same eerie distance. Panic welled up inside her. She quickened her pace, but the light did too. Finally, she spun around and shouted at it to leave her alone. In that moment, the light shot upwards, then vanished into the dark canopy above. Margaret hurried home, telling herself it must have been her imagination. But it wasn't. A week later, she took the same path, only to be confronted by the light again, this time directly in front of her. She described it as a glowing orb that seemed sentient, hovering just yards away. It would stop when she stopped, move when she moved, almost as if it was taunting her. Then, with what she could only describe as a sinister playfulness, It began to dart back and forth, performing what looked like a mocking dance. With every movement, it felt as though it was studying her, assessing her fear. That summer, the light continued to stalk her each time she walked that road after dark. Locals began whispering about her encounters, dubbing it the cold water orb. Despite multiple sightings, no one dared accompany her, and the light never revealed itself to anyone else. Some said it was swamp gas. Others believed it to be the ghost of a long-dead traveler. But Margaret was certain it was something more, something malevolent. Years later, the tale faded into obscurity, overshadowed by newer legends, until the arrival of an Airbnb guest decades after the initial sightings. The house was a rustic cabin sitting near the end of Hollow Road, rented by a couple looking for a quiet weekend getaway. The listing boasted mountain serenity and untouched nature, a perfect escape from city life. The couple, Lisa and Dan, checked in on a Friday afternoon, excited for a peaceful retreat. The cabin was charming in its isolation, nestled deep in the woods, just a short walk from where Margaret had once seen the mysterious light. The first night passed without incident, but the unease began to settle in when strange things started happening on the second night. Around midnight, they heard soft whispers coming from the edge of the forest. Dan grabbed a flashlight, convinced it was some prankster or local wildlife. But when he shone the light into the woods, he caught sight of a floating orb about 10 feet off the ground, pulsating with a sickly green glow. It flickered, almost like it was alive. Lisa watched in horror as it began to move toward them, seemingly curious, but with an unmistakable air of menace. Dan stepped back inside, locking the door, but the orb stayed just outside the window, hovering menacingly. The cabin's temperature plummeted, and a deep sense of dread filled the room. They tried to dismiss it as some optical illusion or trick of the light, but the terror was real. That night, the lights in the cabin flickered, and they heard scratching sounds on the walls, as if something was trying to get in. The next morning, they decided they had had enough. They packed their bags and left without even staying for the final night. The story of their terrifying encounter spread through online forums and local news, reviving interest in the legend of Hollow Road. Others who had stayed at the Airbnb claimed to experience similar encounters. Lights appearing out of nowhere, had strange whispers in the night, and even dreams of being chased through the woods by something they couldn't see. Locals once again began speaking of the cold water orb, speculating that the old stories had truth to them. The town tried to market it as a ghostly attraction for a while, but the encounters only grew darker. The Airbnb was eventually removed from all rental platforms, with its owners claiming they could no longer guarantee the safety of their guests. Some even say the light followed a few visitors home, plaguing them with nightmares and unexplained phenomena for weeks after. My family and I visited Hollow Road one last time, hoping to solve the mystery of the lights once and for all. We went during the day, determined not to encounter whatever haunted the place at night. As we walked the narrow path through the woods, I couldn't help but feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. There was an unsettling silence, no birds, no rustling leaves, just the heavy atmosphere of a place steeped in dark history. We didn't wait for sunset. There was no desire to risk seeing the orb for ourselves. The woods felt wrong, as though they harbored secrets better left undiscovered. We left Coldwater Creek with more questions than answers. To this day, the mystery of the Coldwater lights remains unsolved. What was it? A ghost? A warning? Or something even more otherworldly? No one can say for certain, but one thing is clear. The Airbnb scare has added another chilling chapter to a legend that refuses to fade into the dark. These events took place only within the last 48 hours. Writing this story down so quickly is my way of preserving the accuracy of what happened. To set the scene, my cousin, his girlfriend, and 2 aunts came to visit me for a short getaway. They drove up from a small town in the Midwest to a secluded area near Ravenwood Heights, a place known for its old Victorian homes and eerie silence that falls as soon as the sun sets. They rented an Airbnb for 3 nights and 4 days, a 2-story colonial house with a neglected garden and towering oak trees, the kind of place you'd picture in an old ghost story. My cousin and his girlfriend stayed there while my aunts found lodging elsewhere. The house was only 5 minutes away from my place, nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac off a long, winding road surrounded by thick woods and abandoned properties. On the first night, they invited myself, my boyfriend, my brother, and another cousin over to hang out. We brought some drinks and snacks to catch up and have a fun night. They had just gone out to grab some more supplies for the evening when I stayed behind with my cousin's girlfriend and my brother. We were chatting in the kitchen when something out of the corner of my eye caught my attention. A shadow, or rather, what looked like the leg of a person frozen mid-step, just hovering in the air. It was so quick and subtle that I almost brushed it off, but a deep chill crept up my spine. We were the only ones in the house, yet there it was, clear as day. Before I could say anything, the overhead light in the kitchen began flickering violently. My brother, who has always had this uncanny sensitivity to strange energies, went pale. He and I exchanged nervous glances, half laughing, half hoping the other would dismiss it as nothing. I decided not to mention the ghostly leg, not wanting to frighten my cousin's girlfriend, who had to sleep there. The rest of the night went by without further incident, but an oppressive tension lingered in the air, as if something was watching from the shadows. We all left the house early in the morning, though my brother left a little earlier than the rest of us. The next day, I stopped by to bring them breakfast and coffee. It was a warm, sunny morning, one of those bright summer days where you'd expect to feel light and cheerful. Yet as soon as I stepped inside, the house felt suffocatingly cold, as if all warmth had been drained away. The air was thick with an oppressive heaviness that clung to my skin like damp cobwebs. I suggested we sit out on the porch to get some fresh air, but my cousin and his girlfriend refused, saying they preferred staying inside. They seemed more on edge than usual, their eyes darting nervously toward the darkened corners of the room. As I sat there with them, I couldn't shake the sense that something was terribly wrong. My gaze kept drifting toward the hallway connecting the kitchen to the bedrooms, the very spot where I'd seen the apparition the night before. The shadows seemed deeper there, almost alive, as if they were writhing just beyond the edge of perception. Though nothing specific happened, the tension was palpable, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I noticed the girlfriend fidgeting with her necklace, her eyes wide with barely concealed fear, but I still kept my experience to myself. Later that night, my cousin called me, his voice trembling. He told me that while they were in bed, they heard soft whispers coming from the hallway. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was menacing, filled with anger and malice. The room grew colder and colder until they could see their breath in the dim light of the nightstand lamp. Then they heard it, a loud bang coming from the basement, like something heavy had been thrown against the wall. They were both too terrified to investigate, choosing instead to huddle together under the covers, praying for morning to come. By the third night, they were desperate to leave. They couldn't get through their stay fast enough. On the final night, while packing their bags, they both felt a strong, icy grip on their ankles, yanking them off their feet. In a panic, they bolted out of the house without looking back, abandoning some of their belongings in their rush to escape. They drove straight to my place in the dead of night, shaken and pale. The next day, we all went back together in the daylight to retrieve the rest of their things. The house seemed almost mocking in its silence, as if it knew it had won. My cousin didn't say much, but as he stepped back inside to grab his suitcase, I saw his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. We never spoke about what happened after that. They left town a day early, unwilling to spend another minute near that place. I've driven past the house since then, but it looks different, darker somehow, even under the sun. The windows seem to watch, and the shadows behind them hold secrets that are better left undiscovered. Whatever lurks in that house was more than just a trick of the light. I can only hope no one else decides to stay there long enough to find out what it truly wants. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.